Okay, today we're going to talk about theater, which is chapter 8 in your textbook. Theater is one of my favorite genres of art to talk about. There's just so much to it, and there's so many levels of meaning and depth. But today we're just going to do an overview of theater and talk about a little bit about what your book talks about. So the first thing is the elements of drama. Your textbook talks quite a bit about Aristotle and his elements of drama. They're as follows. First is the plot. Of course, you know what the plot is. The series of events, the action of the play. What happens is the plot. There are also characters, so those people that are involved in the plot. Diction is a new one that you probably aren't super familiar with. Basically, this is the language of the play. And usually this is a specific style. So for example, Shakespeare used a very specific style called iambic pentameter in most of his plays. There's also thought, so those ideas that underlie the plot. Think of thought as subject matter. So when we talked about subject matter, when we were talking about painting and sculpture, the thing that's being represented or the idea that's being represented, that's thought. There's also spectacle. So this is what in literature you think of as the setting. So the place of the action, set design, any costumes, and any other visual elements that are given to you in the play. And there's music. So don't think of musicals necessarily, but in Greek drama, often there was dialogue that was sung or chanted. But in modern drama or modern theater, what we think of as plays, not musicals, we very rarely see any sort of music. So very specifically, I wanted to talk about the plot. There are specific parts of a dramatic plot. If you ever analyze short stories or anything like that, this might look familiar to you. But this is Aristotle's dramatic arc. So it starts off, notice that our axes are time and tension. So it starts off at the beginning with relatively little tension, exposition, that's the background. Then once the background is over, there's rising action, so the action starts to speed up, things start to get more tense. And then you'll notice a distinct rise in the tension when there's some sort of crisis. So the characters go through some sort of crisis, whether that be an action-related crisis or an internal crisis of some sort. And that peaks at the climax. So that's where all the conflict basically blows up in your face. And then notice that there's a very quick decline of tension in the falling action. So after the climax, after the conflict blows up in the character's face, relatively quickly the action is over. And then there's the denouement, which is basically the wrap-up. Aristotle also has a reversal in here. Most often in the climax and in the falling action there's a reversal. Sometimes that means a reversal of fortune, basically. And this little chart leaves off the catharsis. So that's where the audience feels refreshed or feels like basically they've got a load off their chest because they've been able to see the wrap-up of this drama. So don't forget about that as you think about plot. But the characters and the certain themes that come in are also important. One thing that is important to talk about are archetypes or archetypal patterns. So here's the dictionary definition, the structural principles that govern the shape of dramatic narrative. But in more layman's terms, basically these are those psychological patterns that you react to when you're watching a play, something that you identify with. So you can have characters or situations. Here are some examples. The good versus evil archetypal pattern. So there's, think about old westerns. There's a bad guy and a good guy, and you want the good guy to win. That's an archetypal pattern. Or there are archetypal characters like the mentor or the father or mother figure, or even the innocent youth or something like that. It's really important not to think of archetypes as stereotypes. Those are very different things. Archetypes are things that we connect with to kind of show the idea of humanity. This is where we get into the human condition that we've been talking about all semester. Archetypes are those underlying patterns, whereas stereotypes are shallow. Archetypes are not. Think about it as Carl Jung says. So the power of the archetype reveals through art the imprinting of the human experience. So basically what that means is that this is how we find connection to this type of art, these archetypes. So I just thought this was kind of fun. This is something that gives you a little bit of an idea of the archetype. There are many archetypes, and these are some good examples. So I really like the Toy Story 3 one. So the lethal frenemy. And the most famous example is Iago from Othello. So basically Iago pretends to be Othello's friend, but really is very jealous of Othello and all Othello has, and he plots against him. And I thought that it was funny that they used Lotso. So Lotso may smell like strawberries, but he certainly ain't sweet. So thinking about archetypes in that way. Now we're to theatrical genres. So the big one is tragedy. When we talk about Aristotle's rules of drama and all those parts of drama, that's what he was working on, was tragedy. He wasn't so big on comedy. And there's the idea of the tragic hero. So if you've ever heard of tragic hero, which you probably you probably know quite a few examples of a tragic hero. Almost all of Shakespeare's characters are tragic heroes, like Othello or Macbeth or King Lear. So this is Macbeth over here to the right. He has some weaknesses, some tragic flaws, those things that make him a tragic hero and make it so that he cannot survive this play. Plus, he's a person of high rank, he's a noble, and he has a lot of strengths of character. He's very courageous, he's very honorable, but ultimately those tragic flaws make it so that he can't get out alive. And ultimately, I'm sorry if I'm spoiling this for you, but Macbeth dies at the end. So that's that reversal that we talked about. Often tragedy is characterized by death, and the death happens in the reversal. In Macbeth or Romeo and Juliet, those are all good examples. A more modern example, if you watch Sons of Anarchy, I would say that Jax is the kind of the epitome of the tragic hero. And obviously he didn't make it out. Hope that didn't spoil anything for you either. There's also comedy. There are two kinds. Old comedy. So this is what we would think of as slapstick. Charlie Chaplin, The Three Stooges, The Hangover, anything like that. Those are old comedy. Then new comedy is more subtle, and it concentrates on kind of social manners and mannerisms and how we're treating each other and things like that. So I thought Phil Dunphy here, he's a good example of new comedy. And he's also a good example of a type character. In new comedy, there are type characters and stereotypes. So a type character, in this case, he's the goofy dad. I do think that Modern Family doesn't type him in quite as boring of a way as other sitcoms do. And there are stereotypes. So Phil Dunphy's also pretty stereotypical. He's the goofy middle-aged white guy, and he really can't get out of that stereotype. So here's where stereotypes come in comedy, and they're usually much more shallow. Then we have tragicomedy. So this is just a blend. Makes sense, right? But it doesn't necessarily have funny moments in it. It's more of a tragicomedy, meaning people don't necessarily all die in the end. It leaves you feeling very ambiguous about the meaning and kind of, a little bit of hope, but not so much. And I thought a really good example of that is The Green Mile. If you guys remember watching The Green Mile, that's a very good example of tragic comedy. There's some heartwarming moments, but ultimately in the end it's pretty sad, and it leaves you thinking real ambiguous thoughts about society and the time it was set and the characters in it. So in a nutshell, that's what we have to talk about drama. We're going to talk much more deeply in class this week, but this is just an overview. Make sure you take your quiz before Sunday, and I'll see you in class.